for some TV yema obibia akwaba. The best subscribe na like a share video no so a day. Amaya nebusi ebo edwura ensem no emu a. Honorable Haruna Idris ni sembi ende. That's already your diabeto emantene say and they will be cut teacher training allowances mu. Na odi ni nyina akwhye student loan mu a enye asenkutu ede enwonsem ebro no. Ebusi ende Kwesi Pratt ene da na akomia atenase ewo peace dwumadie so ebusia omobobo ensemu a ensemu a wo nso approve wono mu na ebusia enye agodie bi se ekọ na ekweti na eno ana ende Haruna Idrisu ensemu a okanyina ene se we can't be feeding tertiary students ana se obi akọ school edu tertiary level a ewo so no ankasa e feed ne ho the santi and the woman between the nyinam ede ni nyina akohye the student loan scheme mu a ebusia enye asenketwa na eno na Kwesi Pratt ene na akomia atenase wo mobobu ensem mepese beko na yakoti ensem
sir
over
my kind graphic no be 4 times so mintiase ne wo ho no mintiase
teacher training
and I mean hunjina so bi as teacher training allowance you be trouble.
Oh, okay. Just the headline.
Sorry now. As a entry. The Minister of Education, Haruna Idrisu, has announced plans to transition teacher trainee allowances teacher trainee allowances into an enhanced student loan scheme to allow students to cater for their own feeding and personal expenses. Tinio. Next paragraph. The minister explained that while the allowances will be maintained in the interim, the government intended to phase the allowance system out gradually. Next paragraph. There is no way you should be feeding a student at the tertiary level. Emphasis. We can narrow feeding to basic and free senior high schools, but at the tertiary level, students should be able to take care of themselves. In the interim, we will continue with feeding allowances, but we will transition to an enhanced student loans system. And so, okay, it's very confusing.
Two paragraphs.
The minister said this one, so. The team was led by so. The meeting provided the platform for the principals to voice their challenges and explore strategies to enhance learning outcomes, improve quality of education, and
second paragraph.
The loan scheme will be run parallel with the allowances initially. But will eventually adopt the standard practice in all tertiary institutions where students rely on loans instead of direct allowances. So, okay, we have impression say it's not talking about teacher training allowances. It's talking about allowances for tertiary students. Of course, teacher trainees, some of them will fall into the category of tertiary students.
This is colleges of education.
Yes.
University.
Tertiary students have more allowances.
Okay, you get the impression.
So, say allowance. So, training colleges.
No, tertiary students. They can't tertiary. How much allowances?
To say universities.
Yeah, how much allowances? They just teacher training colleges. Teacher training colleges only are tertiary institutions.
Master, report to Ohana me here.
Enfa now can you also tertiary not teacher training? Enfa.
Oh, that be a
one thing.
No, share me particular paragraph. Because now can you is about teacher training allowances, not tertiary. Now can you teacher training allowances, not tertiary. Oh, now mention a name then. Oh, that maybe I can.
There's confusion.
But
there's a lot of confusion.
Okay. But me go to the minister for the very first paragraph. Now, first paragraph, in the boss, The Minister for Education has announced plans to transition teacher trainee allowances into enhanced student loan scheme to allow the students cater for their aid. If I no can say confusion about teacher training.
It's not just talking about general allowance. It's talking about feeding allowance.
But in your teacher training. Because tertiary students don't get allowances.
Baby, or say they will phase the allowance system out gradually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he will continue with the feeding allowance. Kopim say omo ebeka say we die nkofo atiase yenko enhanced loan no e de omo beto aso ama omo allowance ni feeding.
The minister can say you beto aso kosi say students nankasa ebe choose
option.
It's a very confusing report.
Heading no a
very confusing report.
But heading here is very clear. Even from the story, the allowances are going to go. Clear from the story. There will be
Which allowance?
Teacher training allowance.
Your Dabino is referring to feeding allowance.
An allowance is on the other. I'm feeding on the other. An allowance is my
There is no way you should be feeding a student at the tertiary level. We can narrow feeding to basic and free senior high school.
Okay.
But at the tertiary levels, students should be able to take care of themselves. In the interim, we will continue with the feeding allowances, but we'll transition to an enhanced student loan scheme. That's one part. So it's specific feeding.
But there's nothing like feeding allowance.
It's just allowance.
Because it's just allowance. Allowance, you use it for feeding and use it for yourself.
But Nana,
for feeding and for yourself.
Yeah.
For feeding and for yourself.
Yes.
So there's a distinction
between the allowances.
Feeding and yourself.
No, the allowance to my just see a chip say way for feeding and a way for transport. Yeah, they don't do that. They give you the allowance.
The minister, no?
Oh, send there for emphasis.
The part of the allowance.
But I'm saying that the story is clear. The allowance will go. That's the story. That's the gravamen of the story.
No,
and that's gradually.
Yeah, and as it's a process.
And as an option. And so
there you have the allowance and then the loan as an option. And when final your option? Allowance now so chairman then it may option. Which is not available.
You say full or they will go in.
I'll say that stated that the student loan would operate alongside the allowance for a short period. To give students the option before the full transition. So he's talked about transition. I mean, of course, story could have been written better, but the clear government is that the teacher training allowances are going to go.
You are in my domain.
And
you are talking about journalism and story writing. You are in my domain. Where I am all my life. This is what I study. So there is confusion in this story. Lots of confusion in this story.
But you agree that it's about student teacher training allowance?
Not alone.
Which will
the
go.
minister refers to tertiary.
Because teacher training institutions are tertiary institutions.
Fantastic. But it is not only teacher training in a tertiary. There are other tertiary educations.